Greetings and good morning to you, WHAP warriors. Mr. Anderson here, sorely missing you all. I hope you had a wonderful and restful weekend. I apologize about my absence on Friday from Zoom or from making an appearance. I was in no condition to do so. As you can tell, I'm still getting my voice back, and I will look forward to Zooming with you tomorrow. I'm going to withhold on that today. And I will Zoom with you before you play the World Diplomacy game tomorrow. I'm sure you're eager. I got more email questions over one weekend over the World Diplomacy game than I've gotten all year about AP World History. Couple things. If you want to, stop this video right now and take 2 minutes to meet and greet. Right now, hopefully you're seated around the room, spaced out. I know that we have the center table, we have the bank table. Please don't touch any of the game pieces, but if you need to, take your computer and find a quiet spot that you can go to and work and be fairly socially distanced. I think at this point that's a good goal. Every 15 minutes, Mr. Donovan, have them, 12 minutes, get up, move around, keep moving. Go ahead and take a moment to meet and greet with one another, say hello, talk about your weekend, and then we'll get started. All right, please make sure you're writing down what's in bold. There's quite a bit in bold. This is to finish up the Industrial Revolution slideshow and stories and notes. Talking about the Industrial Revolution, you need to talk about capitalism, Adam Smith, and Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith proposed in his book, Wealth of Nations, the idea of laissez-faire capitalism, which is French for hands-off or let the people do as they please. And this became the prevailing attitude towards capitalism all the way up to and including the early 1900s. And the idea was that the capitalism, the idea that people would, the capitalists, people who purchased or provided the funds to purchase the factory, the real estate, the resources in order to produce the goods and sell them, would operate in a unregulated free market economy where competition was unregulated, and that the government would keep their hands out of regulating it in any way, shape, or form. Adam Smith wrote about this and its attributes in The Wealth of Nations of 1776, and he wrote specifically about the three laws of economics. And the three laws of economics were the law of self-interest, law of competition, and the law of supply and demand. And I'm sure Mr. Lowe or Mr. Cal Anderson or your economics teacher could tell you quite a bit more about these than I could. I taught economics once upon a moon about 13 years ago. But either way, these laws became doctrine for capitalists and businessmen and merchants all across the world during this time period who sought to gain riches and sought to make a fortune through capitalism and industrialization. Capitalism as a definition, and I thought I include these because they get thrown around quite a bit nowadays. Capitalism is an economic system in which the factors of production are privately owned and the money is invested in business ventures to make a profit. And that's the basic idea behind capitalism. As you can see here, this is a pyramid of the capitalist system from the view of an industrial worker. You have the industrial workers holding up this plate with the middle class kind of eating and banqueting, with the military above them, with the clergy above them. And then at the top you have the businessmen and the rulers and capitalism at the top. And that was very much a prevailing attitude once the Industrial Revolution was in full swing in the mid-1800s, when there were very few economic and safety guardrails for the people that were actually producing the work. Early economists believed a permanent underclass was necessary to keep prices and wages low, which was going to have an effect on ideas such as philosophical responses to industry and the overworking of the working classes and the underpaying and the dangerous nature of it. There'd be the idea of utilitarianism. Hey, we should create the greatest good for all people. Perhaps we should withdraw and create a utopia, perfect living space with conditions for workers. these were all, theoretically good ideas, but practically very difficult. And so the idea that gained the most traction was the idea of socialism, whereby the factors of production are owned by the public and operate for the welfare of all. The idea that factories, railroads, mines, timber, hospitals, roads, construction, large-scale operations would be owned by the state, and that the state and government would regulate these so that no one would get too rich and no one would be too poor, so to speak, and that workers would benefit from the mining and the timber work and the factory work instead of being exploited as they were being during the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. Government should plan the economy. They believe that government should control the factories, mines, railroads, and key industries. And this would promote an equality of condition, whereby people would have the same relative living conditions. People would have the same relative education and healthcare and compensation. And the idea was to create this equality of condition so that there would be no one too high, no one too low, but more of a middle ground, whereby people would be given certain basic needs for being a part of the working class. This idea also gave rise to communism, which would be kind of the next step in economic discussions developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They would write about their philosophies in books like Das Kapital, but most importantly in the 23-page pamphlet called the Communist Manifesto. The idea behind communism is that it would be a form of complete socialism. That's what often gets confusing. It would be a complete form of socialism where all land, mines, factories, railroads, and businesses would be owned by the workers. That private ownership would end and workers would own the means of production, and that even a government would not be needed to determine who works where and who does what. It would be a perfect workers' state where folks would work at a factory or the mine or in education or healthcare, and they would do so according to their needs, and they would get the fair and equitable share of what society had to offer as far as food and clothing and shelter. Excuse me. And so what often gets confusing is that communism versus communism. There's communism as a economic theory, which is a pure form of socialism where the government is no longer needed and the workers control the means of production. And then there's Communist Party affiliation. Like in China, there's a Communist Party. There's a Communist Party in the DPRK in North Korea, in Cuba. And the Communist Party usually holds as a basic political belief that socialism will give way eventually to communism. Now, has that ever happened? No. And as we get into the 20th century and we study the Russian Revolution and we study China, the Chinese Revolution, and we study Cuba, we will know that most efforts by communist parties to ascend along the economic journey usually stalls in a state of socialism where there is strong or complete and total control by the state of the economy, but rarely, if ever, has it gotten to full communism where the workers control all. And we'll talk about that more when we get to the 20th century. Now, there were other responses to capitalism. The labor movement was the idea of voluntary labor organizations. And these labor movements spoke for workers in a trade, pipe fitters, garment workers, and coal miners were all, they would unionize together, sometimes work together as a collective bargaining unit. but you had teamsters, people who drove wagons. Later on, those are people who drove trucks. Local garment workers, local iron workers, coal miners had their own labor unions who spoke for them in these voluntary labor organizations to help them bargain for bread and butter issues, which were issues that included shorter hours, better working conditions, and higher pay, which are your typical bread and butter working worker issues. For instance, 8 hours of labor, 8 hours of recreation, 8 hours of rest became a prevailing idea. A minimum wage, the idea of minimum wage, which is now on the tip of our tongues, $15 minimum wage is what a lot of people are talking about. But the idea of minimum wage was brought into the forefront by the labor union. And then safer working conditions, having guardrails, having the idea that safety needs to be in the workplace, that people shouldn't come to work sick, that people shouldn't come to work and perhaps get injured or have the real risk at getting injured, and if they do, they should be compensated as such. Labor unions fought hard for these and used strikes. They organized and used strikes to meet their goals, and largely met resistance often, especially in the mid to late 1800s. They met resistance with the coal and iron police. There were riots in Chicago, in Philadelphia, in West Virginia, in Colorado. There were all sorts of riots and street battles between union labor organizations and the government, coal and iron police, the Pinkertons, who were kind of this secretly, this hired group of strike breakers. And one of the most famous battles that would go down would happen on Andrew Carnegie's watch under his manager Henry Frick in Pittsburgh at Carnegie Steel. And so these were widespread, near collisions and battles between the workers and the management. And the labor movement fought vigorously for the rights that we have: the 8-hour work week, the 40-hour work week, the 8-hour work day, 40-hour work week, minimum wage, overtime, sick leave, vacation time. Those are things that the unions fought for. The progressive era was also coincided with this. I call it the progressive umbrella. And the progressive umbrella is this large overarching term. Progressivism kind of covers a lot of ground. It covers the idea of the abolition of slavery, civil rights for African Americans, women's rights. There's a familiar name, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in the Declaration of Sentiments of 1848. Jane Addams and the immigrant assimilation of immigrants was an important idea in America, at least. And then sanitation, George Waring. If I have it, I'm going to include that clip that I need you to watch today or tomorrow. I've been desperately trying to get the little 10-minute clip of George Waring and his White Wings in 1895. And I have to. I'll send it to Mr. Donovan. Also, city planning commissions became important. If you see here's George Waring and his White Wings sweeping up the streets in New York City. And then I always love this picture below here, the idea that, hey, let's take away the trash heaps and give women and children, a little bit out of it, a playground to play on. If you look here, quite the playground, especially this young man falling here. Could you imagine being allowed to play on a playground like that? The merry-go-round was too dangerous for you guys to play on. Can you imagine being allowed to play on this? Always quite humorous, and you can look up playgrounds 1870s, 1880s and find things like that. All right, that's going to conclude the notes. Now what you're going to do is, once you've written all this down, I need you then there should be a second YouTube video, a much shorter one, where I get you started on the primary source analysis, which will be on the Google Classroom. I'm going to read the first couple with you, and then you're going to be on your own to read the rest and to IP those and analyze those. So good luck. Huzzah.